Part 2 of the offices of ICAC, November 24th, 2023. As I mentioned at the start of this video series, I wanted to make sure that even though this isn't a very natural thing for me to do, it's important to get the message out so that people in the public really understand what's happening. We're hearing a lot about AI. We're hearing finally a lot about how people's data is being used. Our technology is betraying us, from our Alexas to our Ring cameras, all spying on us. And this was something I had mentioned 25 years ago to my small circle of friends, and they weren't particularly interested in hearing it. Life is hard enough. Nobody really wants to believe that this sort of thing is happening, but it really is. And it is getting worse. So when I mention these things, it's only because it's absolutely necessary to get the message out. And remember, the police have no problem outing many of us, and so we shouldn't have a problem outing them, because remember, they work for us. We are citizens, we are taxpayers, we are people who are influential in the community no matter what we are doing, whether we're taking care of our elderly, driving buses, being an accountant, in food service, whatever we're doing. We matter as much as they do, and that's the point of this video as well. So I was finishing up with Daniel Albritton, who had done a valiant job trying to explain how a elderly man was somehow guilty of solicitation. And because they had been sloppy, and not because of any other reason, bluntly, they were unable to find evidence to turn over to the defense. And on that basis, the defendant got off. So Todd Ream, the defendant in this case, as I indicated, got off not because of what they were doing online was unconstitutional, or a court had found that it was entrapment or anything. Remember, the courts are not particularly interested in every aspect of the law. There are certain things that they've carved out that are sacred, and other things they're not going to touch, like the Fourth Amendment. So what they have done is, because it violated the rules of evidence, whereby you have to turn over your evidence to the defense so that they can evaluate it and build their defense. And if you fail to turn over everything, that is a reason for dismissing the case. And that's why the case was dismissed, because they hadn't turned it all over. But it just shows you the sloppy techniques of these officers too. They are happy to go after you because they know that the burden of proof for them is very, very small. Usually they can make a claim, come up with some fabricated evidence, or massage the little bit they have of circumstantial evidence, and a court will believe it. And if you don't believe me, talk to the many people that's had it done to them. It is remarkable the number of cases where they have actually gotten away with saying whatever they want and allowing it to stick. Ryan Pick, who lives not far from me here in Virginia, is finishing a 7-year sentence. He has about 18 months left. And he received 2 years based only on a video. 2 of that was 7 years. Based on a video that the officer couldn't describe, a 15-second video. He couldn't show it, rather. He could only describe it. And it was an incredible description that he made, and on that basis alone, the jury convicted him of those additional 2 years. So it's pretty wild, and it doesn't matter if it's a jury trial or a bench trial. We've all seen both. We've seen one or the other. It depends on the attitude in the system toward people convicted of sex offenses, period. So Alberton nearly got away with that one too. I know that he contributed to my case because he was the one who came up to me and asked me to sign off on some paperwork when I was being released from prison or from jail 4 days after my arrest on July, it would have been July 26th, 2018. And they realized I was getting out. They didn't expect me to do that. So they were anxious to rush to my house to ransack it, basically. So they wanted me to sign off on the paperwork, and then they delayed me there while they rushed over to my house and tore it apart. My office had bookcases full of books collapsed into the center. There was damage to 3 of the doors. But interestingly enough, my tenant, who was downstairs and had a lock on his door, they knew because I had told them. They had asked me, do you have a tenant? I told them. Do you have an executable lease? I absolutely do. Okay, we won't touch that. Well, they went down there anyway, kicked in his door, broke the door in half crosswise. He had 5 computers there. They took 0 computers because they weren't there for that. They just wanted to break things. They broke another door. They didn't care. And by the way, they don't have to pay. You cannot go after them and force them to pay. So even though you're not guilty, even if you're found innocent and you're acquitted of all charges, they don't have to pay you back for the damage they do. That's something many people don't realize. So that was Detective Albertin's contribution. The next one is kind of interesting. I'm going to save the best for last. Jesse Katzman, who's now a 2nd lieutenant, I understand. Detective Katzman was the bad cop, wanted to be a tough guy, and he shows up during my interrogation and demands that I tell him where I work. And when I hesitate, he starts screaming at me. And I'll admit I was a bit intimidated. I've never experienced anything like this. I've never been arrested for anything in my whole life. And I was shocked and amazed. And the way he mistreated me and talked down to me, etc., was just indicative of how these folks can be real assholes when they want to be. They really can. And Katzman shows up with Lieutenant Burns a month later in a very interesting case. I had been going to my various court cases by planes, trains, and automobiles, by bus, by borrowed car, walking, and renting a car. And that included the cases in Alexandria where I had pending child custody cases already going on against my ex-wife that I had previously filed prior to my arrest. So I needed to get my car back, and we went to court and got my car back a month after I was released. And my car, when the court ordered them to return it, and they didn't want to, by the way, the court ordered them to return it, and they argued that it was needed. And I understood then what Detective Bauer had been yapping on about. They were laughing because my car was an older model and had a lot of mileage, and that wouldn't get them very much. And I didn't know what they were talking about. Well, civil asset forfeiture is what he was talking about, where they can take your property if they can argue it was in the commission of a crime. And since I went to meet the person, because I was afraid that Alex VA was being trafficked, and I had tried everything else for quite some time. And my idea was I was going to assess the situation, go to the police. I didn't realize I had the police. And when they grabbed my car and they looked through it and they arrested me on the spot, of course, they found nothing to harm any kid in my car, because that's not what I was intending to do. That's not what I was there for. That didn't matter. But they were really irritated about it, and they remembered, because when the court ordered them to return my vehicle and disregarded their views that my car was used in the commission of a felony, I went to a lot adjacent to the police station. and waited for them for over an hour, and they never showed up. I called Lieutenant Burns, who was the I.C.A.C commander at the time, and she told me, just wait there, we'll be there. And I could see my car, but there were no keys in it or anything. So about 20 minutes later, she comes speeding in, and she was accompanied by this Jesse Katzman, the same guy who had been barking at me during the interrogation. And he was there as a witness. He never said a word, I think, that I recall. Not even hello. Excuse me. He just stood there. And Lieutenant Burns said, here, I have a release. Excuse me. She placed a release in my hand and said, sign it. And I looked at her, I said, I'm not signing anything until I get into my car. Well, you have to sign it before we'll give you the keys. I said, I need to get into my car to see what condition it is before I sign a release saying it's in good condition. So, reluctantly, she gave me the keys. I opened my car, and I was wearing a suit and a t-shirt, a dress shirt, and a suit coat. And I sat in the car and leaned back, and immediately felt coming up through my pants and coming through my back moisture. And I reached my hand around. I could feel it was wet all around me. And the seat next to me, I noticed, had tiny little mushrooms growing out of it. And I was enraged. And I came out of the car and I confronted both of them. And they had these innocent, angelic looks on their face. And I said, how did my car get wet? And now I remember, I think it was Katzman who did say to me, he said, oh, you must have left the windows open, which is kind of clever by half, because on that day, my car, it was raining. It had started to rain when I got to the park that day outside of Annandale High School. And it was raining, but I had the windows shut. Why would I be driving with the windows wide open? So the windows were shut. And somebody decided to open the windows and either fill the car with water, or it was so evenly distributed and the back seat and everything, I think somebody hosed it down. I think somebody sprayed the car. And when I confronted them with that, they denied it. Okay. I said, I need my car. They said, well, sign this. Well, the form had two parts to it. One part said it was in good condition. One part said it was in great condition. There was no place to write otherwise. I needed my car, so I signed it, but I demanded a copy. I'm still waiting for the copy. And as I was signing it, I knew they were up to something. So I started signing it, and I tilted my head to look up, and there was Lieutenant Jane Burns with a big shit-eating grin on her face, looking at Katzman and winking at him. It was a game all along. They knew they had done something to my car, and they knew I had no choice because I didn't know anyone enough to come and get me. So, unfortunately, I was stuck. Now, Lieutenant Burns is interesting too, because up to about a year ago, she was the LGBTQ liaison for the police department. Now they have somebody named Lawson, who I will be contacting. But Burns is pretty amazing, because she does a very good public outreach, but in reality, she is just as much a crumb as the rest of them under her command. Truly a loathsome individual. So you have these big swinging guys, and you have these tough guys who want to talk about how, they get the peds off the street and all this other nonsense and all these derogatory terms that they like to use. But I want to save the best for the very last. Nicholas Boffey. Boffey was one who was ahead of his time, apparently. He had spent the most training and had trained a lot of the other people. And what Nicholas Boffey did was he did the forensic analysis. And he taught them all the little shortcuts and all the sneaky maneuvers and all the way that you can begin moving pieces, parts around. And as a result of that, he taught them all the sneaky little maneuvers that they could do in order to conceal their efforts. Unfortunately, Detective Bauer appears to be a little bit of a slow learner because, as I will discuss in my book and maybe later on, he or somebody used a snipping tool, but they did it poorly. They didn't know what they were doing. And so there's pieces of a early conversation with Alex VA that really doesn't make sense. It was like they were experimenting and playing with it. We do have evidence they were driving around with the locator on my phone still active, trying to figure out something. But they were supposed to have the phone turned off and locked in a Faraday box and unable to access so that none of the data could be manipulated. So they exposed the data wittingly or unwittingly to manipulation. Boffey's also interesting for this reason, and I'll end with this. When I was in jail, I met a young man. I will give his initials as BJ. And BJ had met Nicholas Boffey on the Grindr gay, lesbian, bisexual website when he was 16, I believe. I think it was 15 or 16. When Detective Boffey had hit him up under a persona. And I want to get this right. No, I'm going to scratch that. That's not the case. When he was 21, and Detective Boffey was pretending to be a 16 or 17-year-old. Sorry, I have it backwards. I'm doing this from my memory, not notes. But Detective Boffey hit him up. And when he was arrested, BJ got off on a misdemeanor charge. And he got off on a misdemeanor because Detective Boffey intervened and convinced his fellow officers that it wouldn't be right to destroy this young man's life. Right after the case was resolved, BJ went back on Grindr to find a male companion of around his age, and he was solicited by Detective Boffey again. But Detective Boffey reminded him what he had done for him and asked that they could get together romantically or sexually. And this young man said no and blocked him. Now, the sad part is I got to meet him 10 years later as a 31-year-old, and BJ was in jail because he was a meth salesperson, I guess. He sold meth wholesale or retail, I can't remember. I think he had changed to wholesale, and he was very concerned that the case would go federal. And I went to the law library, did some research for him, and sure enough, he was going to get 28 years, and that's exactly what he got. He went to federal prison. So it's very interesting, these great men and women of the police force. They put out, Fairfax County does these glitzy videos, and in these glitzy videos, constantly you see them talk about themselves and their career, humanizing them, and at the end they say, because I'm a Fairfax County police officer. But what the public doesn't know is just how dishonest and weaselly many of them are, at least the ICAC 5 that I've highlighted. Hope you enjoyed this and you understand, for those of you who have been impacted by the police, when the probation officers and the courts and others try to tell you what a scumbag you are and why you are sick and so on and so forth, well, maybe you have problems and maybe you need to solve those problems and maybe you need professional help. But these are not people who have your best interests at heart. They're not trying to help you, placing you in intrusive psychological evaluations and assessments which go no place, which I will discuss at a later date, are nothing but harmful, not only to your psyche, but to your ability to heal and get on with your life. And they add that on top of the already onerous probation requirements, the registration requirements, the impossibility of getting a good quality job so that you can retire with dignity, so that you can make a contribution again. They load all this onto you, and then they say, I just don't understand why you haven't made it. So understand that you are no worse than they are, and you are loved, and you are somebody who has a redemptive quality. You are not garbage like they want you to believe about yourself. And everybody can be redeemed, and you need to understand that. So I hope that was somewhat helpful. Please send comments privately or publicly. I read them all, and I appreciate hearing anything about it. As I said, this is not something I naturally take to like ducks to water. I would rather not have to do it at all. Thank you for listening.